Hi guys, it's Ali McKenzie here, sports physio from the UK, and welcome back to another episode of Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast. On today's episode, we have part one in a three-part series with Matthew Buckthorpe. Matt is a sports science, strength and conditioning coach, researcher and lecturer from the UK. He has a ton of experience working in elite performance, and he specialises in particular in late-stage on-field rehab. In the first episode, Matt is going to discuss his PhD work around the determinants of rate of force development and how it relates to both injury and performance. In the follow-ups parts 2 and 3, Matt is going to discuss some of his clinical frameworks and perspectives around producing high-quality on-field rehab. Matt has an excellent way of translating research to clinical practice, and these conversations provide a lot of insight that I'm sure you will find useful to inform your performance. Additionally, links to all Matt's research discussed across this series will be available in the show notes.
This episode has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of ForceDecks, the world's fastest, easiest and most powerful dual force plate system. ForceDecks can help you to analyse neuromuscular strength, performance and imbalances in your athletes. With an incredibly simple setup and intuitive software, ForceDecks automatically detects over 15 common force plate tests and analyses them with a single click, helping you to collect quick and accurate insights on your athletes. To learn more, head over to our sponsor, volperformance.com.
You're listening to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast with me, Alistair McKenzie, and here is today's episode with Matthew Buckthorpe. Matt, thanks for coming on the show, mate, and giving up some of your time. How are you, bud?
Yeah, very good. Thanks for having me, Ali. It's great to join you.
It's a pleasure. So I'm really looking forward to having these conversations with you because we're going to talk a lot about some really interesting practical insight. We're going to split the series into two key topics, really. We're going to look at rate of force development and the performance and injury perspectives around that. And then the second part, we're going to talk about your on-field papers. So how do you create high quality on-field rehab? So lots of good content in there. I'm really looking forward to it. But before we get started, do you mind just giving a bit of a introduction to yourself and your background for the listeners?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, of course. So, obviously Matt Buckthorpe, I guess from sport and exercise science background. So kind of came through sports science, first at kind of Leeds Uni and then on to Loughborough, where I did sports science kind of interdisciplinary wise, and then stayed on and did a PhD in neuromuscular performance, same place up at Loughborough. Had a bit of a stint in football for a couple of years, just some internships as we all need to do to get our experience, of course, and then really started to get quite a strong passion for late stage rehab, on-field rehab during my time at Fulham. They had a very, very good medical department there and an excellent on-field coach in Sean Reid at that point. So I got really interested in that on-field side. And what I kind of noticed was this disconnect between sort of sport and exercise science, strength and conditioning, and physiotherapy as a whole. So I really wanted to embed myself within a medical team. So I joined Isokinetic medical group about 10 years ago. So Isokinetic are a FIFA Medical Centre of Excellence. They have 7 clinics over in Italy, and then they built one in London as well. And yeah, I kind of joined them with a view of improving my understanding around rehab, improve my understanding particularly around on-field rehab, late-stage rehab, with a viewpoint of becoming a better sport and exercise scientist. Originally, if I'm being honest, with a view of going back into football, with that kind of enhanced understanding of sports medicine. But then the more years I kind of did it, I got a stronger passion for late stage rehab and probably less so for performance. I'm still very interested in performance, but I particularly enjoy that late stage rehab, that on field piece. And Isokinetic was a good environment for me to do that. So I spent 5 years in a clinical capacity with Isokinetic, sort of doing the on field rehab, late stage reconditioning, pool based stuff. And then focused around education and research. So started to push a focus on translational research, trying to get some of the processes we were doing there published. And then a couple of years ago, I joined St Mary's University, Twickenham in London, in a sort of lecturing capacity. And so I'm based in kind of physiology and S&C capacity up at St Mary's. That's kind of my story to date, I guess.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, a lot of experience with a lot of highly qualified, practitioners to learn from, but also some of the papers that you publish kind of reflect that, I think, with your on-field rehab and your ACL and your hamstring kind of things, that transition and the combining the two. I really did get a sense when I was reading through those that it's performance focused rehab really.
Yeah, exactly. And then one piece I forgot there was I spent a bit of time working with the guys over at Southampton Football Club for a few years. Again, focused on that kind of translational research. So working with the guys there, we did a couple of hamstring pieces around hamstring injury prevention. And as you said, it's kind of, for me, it's about inputting sport and exercise science, S&C, into the rehab process. And I think there's still a tendency for depends what you want to call it, if you want to call it rehab, but the recovery process after injury is still very medicalized. And I think what happens is there is this continuum from medicine through to performance, or from, that early stage right the way through to returning people to performance. And in the end, we're getting people back to performance. In order to do that, you've got to know about performance science. And a lot of what I thought was relevant, in terms of sports science and S&C, particularly neuromuscular function, I just didn't have the confidence in the first couple of years. And so first couple of years in the medical team, I was a bit passive, and I just thought, I think this is relevant, but I don't know enough to challenge the medics. And then, as you said there, I think it's so relevant, like S&C, sports science, a lot of exercise medicine is so relevant for the injury process. And yeah, so I have a big passion on translating that now into practice.
Yeah, brilliant, mate. And I agree. And I think from my journey at the moment where I'm on like the physio side, and everything I'm reading, or the way I'm trying to project and the trajectory of my career is way more performance focused now. So I'm kind of comfortable with a lot of the medical side, but now it's like, all right, how can I put load into him as soon as possible, and what's appropriate? How can I maintain? So especially with the on-field rehab that we're going to talk about, when I read through that paper and I was reading about some of the preventing deconditioning and that kind of thing. So for me, it's how to enhance that as early as possible to dampen that blow when they get your time loss. So yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to hearing that one. But the first one we're going to talk about is just all about rate of force development. So you've published a few. I know you were with John Folland at Loughborough, right? And so you published quite a few around rate of force development and the importance of it. And I think it's a topic that's discussed quite a lot now. So let's dive in. And firstly, I guess, just what is rate of force development and how do we measure it, and what does it mean for us clinically?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, sure. So yeah, obviously my PhD was around rate of force development, particularly around sort of the neural contributions to it. And as you said, I got with Jonathan Folland, and they've got a fantastic lab up there. Jonathan's done some tremendous work in this area. And he's got, a lot of people like myself who have done PhDs under him. But yeah, in terms of rate of force development, it's essentially distinct from maximal strength. And there are two forms of strength, really. One's maximal, which is your ability to produce your peak force. And rate of force development is your ability to increase force from low or resting levels as fast as possible. So rather than the peak force you can achieve, it's much more concerned with the slope of the force time curve, or going from low to high very, very fast. So it has more of a time dependent factor on it, increasing force as quickly as possible.
Yeah, brilliant. And with regards to, you just touched on there some of the neural components. With your PhD, what kind of things did you look at and what contributes from both a neural and kind of contractile perspective with regards to rate of force development?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, PhD was looking at neural determinants, and essentially when you're looking at the determinants, you're thinking, okay, what factors explain differences in performance across different people? So why is one person stronger than someone else, or why does someone get stronger after a period of training? And it's trying to detail those underpinning mechanisms. And so my PhD was mostly concerned with the neural mechanisms. So I wanted to understand how important is the nervous system. And in terms of my PhD, one of the pieces was a paper with Jonathan Folland on the determinants of rate of force development. And we looked at using surface electromyography some intrinsic contractile properties, which basically means we're electrocuting people in essence. So sending electrical signals down there. We did the knee extensors. So sending electrical signals into the femoral nerve to make the muscle contract without voluntary control. So you can basically look at the muscle's capacity for force production without voluntary control. So theoretically, it's the potential of the muscle. And then what you do is you look at the potential or the capacity versus what people can actually do. And you can work out some kind of ratio there. And so we were looking at neural control with surface EMG and then comparing voluntary versus evoked force to look at that capacity. And as well as the twitch kind of force, you can also look at the twitch characteristics in terms of like rate of force development and how fast those twitch characteristics change. And what we really detailed was that rate of force development has different determinants depending on the time of the force that you're looking at. So with rate of force development, you've got force onset and you've got peak force, and then you've got the slope. And so the slope actually isn't just a linear line. It starts out quite slow, it has a rapid period, and then it slows down a little bit before hitting the peak force. And you can basically assess it either as peak rate of force development or in distinct time windows. So we were looking at 0 to 50, 50 to 100, and 100 to 50. 100 to 50. The main reason we do that is because depending on the time, that dictates the relevance to sports performance. So injuries happen really quickly. So an ACL injury happens within 50 milliseconds after ground contact. So as soon as you hit the floor, 50 milliseconds, you've ruptured your ACL. Very similar time frame with ATFL sprains as well. So really rapid. Sprint running has ground contact times of around 100 milliseconds at top speed, whereas things like drop jumps are a little bit longer, and cutting and changing direction, you're looking more around 200, 250 milliseconds. So lots of movements have different time characteristics. So we wanted to understand the determinants at different time points. And in essence, what we showed was the very early phase was mostly influenced by neural activation. So your ability to go from essentially off to peak activation, which makes sense. It's kind of the same as going from low force to high force. How quickly can you activate those muscles and go from low activation to high activation? So I like to term that EMG rise. So how fast can you increase the EMG or the neural activation? The middle period, which is the fastest slope of the force time curve, that was explained by mostly the what's called the octet. It's basically really high frequency electrical stimulation that drives the muscle at its maximal rate of force development. So basically the muscle tendon unit's capacity for rate of force development, that was the main determinant of performance during the middle phase. That's probably because most people are at full activation already. So it takes maybe 50 milliseconds to achieve full activation. Some people are a lot faster, some are slower. And then the middle period, when you already have high activation, it's more about the contractile properties of the muscle. And then basically from 100 milliseconds onwards, maximal strength explains performance. So the relevance there is that if you're looking at time, looking at motion that has a time characteristic longer than 100, 150 milliseconds, strength is going to be the main determinant. Anything less than 100 milliseconds, neural activation and contractile properties will be the main determinants. The role of maximal strength changes through the time period. It's very small at the start, very strong role towards the end of the force time curve. And that makes sense as you start to get towards the peak of that curve as well.
Yeah, fantastic answers, mate. A lot of questions I've already going to ask already answered. But
sorry, I've ruined those ones.
No, it's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant. Carry on. I guess one of my questions around the neural properties around EMG, I've been obviously reading up around this before we sat down, is the rate coding seems to be an important characteristic. So how fast you can send signals. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between rate coding and motor recruitment when it comes to an EMG perspective?
Yeah, of course. So obviously we've got two parallel mechanisms of controlling force. So rate coding essentially is the frequency at which we're driving the muscle. So the relevance for that is that obviously we've got different types of force production. So you've got what's called a twitch. A twitch is basically a single electrical impulse that goes into the muscle, and it causes quite a low intensity contraction. And then it relaxes very quickly. So it sees this little change. And depending on the fiber type, you have different twitch responses. So we know that slow twitch has a slow increase in force, reasonably low levels of force, and then a slow relaxation time. So that's why they're called slow twitch. When you contract them with electrical activity, they show a slow force time curve. And then they get faster and higher as you go towards the other, type 2As and type 2Xs. So type 2X has a very steep and short time curve. It contracts really quickly and it relaxes really quickly. So that those muscles, of course, are very designed for switching on and off at very high forces very rapidly. So that's why they're typically used for things like sprinting, of course. They're also fatigable. So that's how we control, to some degree, force, is we send higher firing frequencies into the muscle. And it takes at least 50 hertz to drive the muscle at its maximal force production to create tetanic fusion of the muscle. So we need 50 hertz really to drive a muscle maximally. And so we can, if we don't drive the muscle at a sufficient firing frequency, we won't see maximal force production. The other element is around recruitment. So we know, based on what's called the Henneman size principle, that you recruit slow motor units first, and then the larger, faster motor units get recruited in the systemic order. So basically, we, under low force contraction, we use our postural stabilizers, our low threshold motor units, because they're designed for low force jobs. And then as the task requires more and more force, we start to recruit these type 2 motor units. So most of the time when we're talking about voluntary activation, we're normally talking about an inability to recruit the really high threshold motor units, so your type 2Xs, because they've got a higher threshold. They're a lot harder. You need much higher neural drive to be able to activate them. Whereas normally firing frequency is maximal in most muscles, and then recruitment's normally the missing bit. For me, where this becomes really relevant actually is more for rate of force development, because the firing frequency to achieve peak rate of force development is much higher. So it takes 300 hertz. That means 300 signals per second to drive the muscle at its maximal rate of force development. And so it's probably quite easy to achieve peak fusion of a muscle maximally, but it's hard to drive the muscle at its maximal rate of force development. And that's really where things like ballistic training, plyometric training, Olympic lifting, all of these explosive strength training variables are all around trying to fire that motor unit at a much faster frequency. So that's what we're trying to train. So when we're talking about rate coding, we're trying to send more and more signals to the muscle to increase its force production a lot faster. On an EMG level, you can look at rate coding through what's called the frequency analysis. So you can look at, how many of these signals are getting fired through the EMG analysis. And so if you've got a high frequency, you're going to have higher firing rates. A lower frequency, you've got lower firing rates. So the relevance there would be that the EMG is a useful tool for looking at firing frequency versus recruitment. If you analyze that signal, and EMGs come on a lot in recent years. So now it's becoming quite an advanced technique that's very different to what it was 5-10 years ago. The EMG stuff now, you can consider frequency and recruitment as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And we had Andreas Hegge on the show a while ago, and he used high density EMG on hamstrings, which is an example of what you're talking about, is how it's advanced. In that episode, and in parts of your paper, especially with John Folland, you talked about the contractile elements, and even things like the effective architecture of the muscle will determine how, so for a pinnated muscle, will determine how it can stay close to its ideal for length to contract. And with regards to like training at different muscle lengths and fascicle lengths and stuff like that, can you discuss a little bit about the role of architecture on rate of force development in that respect?
Yeah, of course. So obviously, when we're thinking about rate of force development, we're always thinking about, we've got to contract the muscle. The muscle, of course, contracts, it pulls on tendon, and then the tendon will of course act on bone. So everything we're doing is the neuromuscular and tendinous skeletal systems all interacting together. And obviously, a lot of the time, people sometimes presume that the muscle runs from tendon end to tendon end, and we know it doesn't. We know that muscles will insert on the tendon aponeurosis in terms of they have an angle of pronation, and so they don't run from end to end of the free tendon. They insert into the aponeurosis, and when they contract, they pull on the aponeurosis or the epimysium tendon sheath, and then that pulls on the end of the tendon. So obviously, muscles can have their fascicles arranged in different angles, and depending on the arrangement, that depends whether or not you have more muscle fibers in series or more muscle fibers in parallel. So more muscle fibers in parallel, so next to each other, means that you've got more muscle fibers to produce force. So you've got a higher cross-sectional area, a higher physiological cross-sectional area. So that means you can potentially produce more force. Obviously, they're not getting pulled at a straight angle, so they're going off at an angle. So that means that for every increase in fiber size, you actually lose a little bit of strength, because based on maths principles, the cosine of the angle basically. But won't worry too much on that. Basically, for rate of force development, obviously, with it been isometric and with it been at low velocity, in series is probably slightly less relevant. So the in series stuff means that you've got more muscle fibers in series in a row. So you've got better shortening velocity. So that's more designed for high velocity movements. So the hamstrings, we know, work at high velocities during sprinting. So we need muscles to be in series. We need longer muscle fascicles. For rate of force development, the evidence isn't fantastic. But you would expect to have more fascicles in parallel. You would then expect to have a stronger muscle, so you would be able to produce more force. But you would also potentially expect the relative rate of force development to drop. So the absolute rate of force development might be better because you're technically stronger, but then the relative rate of force development will drop because those muscles can't shorten at the same rate, so they won't shorten as quickly. So I guess it's that trade-off between relative and absolute force, and the relevance, of course, for injuries, I think, is more relevant. For muscle injuries is where our angle of pronation becomes much more relevant. So we've got the guys out of Australia with their excellent stuff on muscle fascicle length and angle of pronation. And if the longer the muscle fascicle, the less likely it is to get damage through eccentric contractions. But I think where rate of force development falls down at the moment is most of it's isometric, and so it's done, without an impact of velocity really, and it's normally done in single joint situations that are quite controlled. So we probably don't fully understand the role of architecture yet on RFD, but I think as we advance technologically wise, we'll probably know a bit more.
Yeah, fantastic. And we touched a little bit earlier on the role of rate of force development in athletic performance and injury prevention. If we focus a little bit on performance first, we spoke about the amount of force that you can produce in the first 100 milliseconds with regards to contact of sprinting. Change of direction, I'm assuming, maybe a little bit longer. What are your thoughts around assessing that and assessing an athlete's ability to do that? What kind of tools do you use, and potentially how would you go and try and influence a positive change when you find something that might be down?
Yeah, sure. So as you said there, I think it's important that we do assess rate of force development as part of an athlete's overall screening protocol. So we do know maximal strength's one variable, but your rate of force development is equally important. I like to place these into contexts with the other neuromuscular performance measures, so reactive strength index and, of course, peak power, and also sort of the role of coordination as well. But rate of force development is one important variable, probably a mix 5 neuromuscular variables. So I always put it into context. When I was first doing my research, I was like, it's all about rate of force development. And then you realize that it's just one variable amongst a mix of lots of variables. And as researchers, we get so obsessed with our little area. But So rate of force development should be included as part of a battery of tests. So we should be looking at max strength, rate of force development, peak power, reactive strength index, as an overall neuromuscular profile. But in terms of measuring rate of force development, generally I would say you should assess it under a compound task like an isometric mid-thigh pull or an isometric squat. And the reason I said isometric is because at the moment, we don't have a good enough understanding of how velocity impacts rate of force development. So we know based on the force velocity curve that when you see an increase in velocity, you can't produce as much force. And so during something like a jump, we're going from a static to a dynamic situation. We're increasing velocity, acceleration. So the better the rate of force development at the start, the faster we'll be moving towards the end of the jump, which means that actually we're on a different bit of that force time curve. So velocity impacts our rate of force development measures. So that's why we normally do it isometrically. It's also a little bit more reliable as well. And so most of the time, I would say use an isometric squat or a mid-thigh pull squat. You should do explosive contractions. So what I mean by that is the instruction should be produce force as quickly and as hard as possible, as fast and as hard as possible. And what you should also make sure you do is you obviously have a reliable setup. So it should use typically inbuilt or portable force plates. Those force plates should be obviously, of course, controlled and making sure that you've set them up properly, of course. And one of the other things we do need to consider when measuring it is what time points do we measure? So are we interested in 50, 100 or 150 milliseconds? Are we interested in peak rate of force development? Are we interested in relative rate of force development? So that means rate of force development scaled to maximal strength. And then also alongside that, we need to make sure we've got a very stiff measurement system. So rate of force development, if you have a very what's called compliant system. So a lot of people use the isokinetic machine, and the isokinetic machine has a lot of padding. So when you first start to produce force, the padding actually takes up that early bit of force as you start to compress the padding. So you need a really stiff measurement system. So if you're going to measure single joint situations, you shouldn't have a lot of padding in like you have with an isokinetic machine. Or if you're going to use a compound system, something like an isometric strength rig is useful. So I would say measure in a compound movement, squat, mid-thigh pull. If you're doing it as part of rehab, or you're interested in, of course, injury prevention, you might want to measure some single joint situations. So maybe some hamstring rate of force development and knee extensor rate of force development. Or if you're rehabbing an Achilles tendon, you might look at, plantar flexor rate of force development. So on a performance level, I would say stick to compound tasks. On a prevention level, you might start to hone in a little bit more on certain muscle groups. And then on a rehab level, your course could be looking at shoulder. You could be looking at external rotation rate of force development or knee extensor rate of force development. But generally on a performance level, stick to compound tasks. Use explosive contractions. Make sure that you're doing what's called a short explosive contraction. So rather than asking them to produce force rapidly and holding it for 5 seconds, do very short 1 second bouts. So basically you produce force explosively, then you relax. And the main reason you do that is because rate of force development is really not reliable at all. So you need to get multiple contractions and you need to average across those contractions. So if you're doing explosive and maximal tasks where you ask them to produce force as quickly as possible and you sustain it, they're going to start to get fatigued and you can't do as many of those. So you should split off maximal and explosive. So what I would say is if you're doing a squat setup, 3 isometric squat contractions, 5 seconds each with a minute's rest in between, then go straight into an explosive strength bout. So you should do 10 explosive contractions lasting 1 second each with 30 seconds, 20 to 30 seconds in between as well. In terms of analyzing that trace, you don't want to have counter movement. So you can't have a dip followed by a push because that massively impacts the signal, so that you can't have a counter movement in the force trace. And you shouldn't really assess the first 50 milliseconds. Even though it's the most relevant, it's also the most unreliable. So my study in 2012 showed that the variability from session to session was almost 20%. So a coefficient of variation of 20%, which means your smallest worthwhile difference is going to be 40%. 40% is very, very hard to see that. And it almost becomes a relevant measure. Plus, if you're using a software that uses an automated system, obviously there are some very good ones on the market. An automated system that does the analysis for you is not going to be as good at identifying those force onsets. So actually the early phase is going to be even less reliable. So what I would suggest is, explosive contractions, maximal force, peak rate of force development, and then probably rate of force development at 100 and 150 milliseconds. And then that will give you a good understanding of someone's profile. So are they strong with poor rate of force development? Have they got good rate of force development and only moderate strength? You can't be really explosive if you're weak. And then from there, of course, your training prescription would be, okay, let's focus on max strength. If you're not that strong and you've got good RFD, focus on max strength. If you're really strong and you've got poor rate of force development, focus on rate of force development. And they both have distinct training. They both have different training elements for them. So maybe you can talk about this in a different question, but strength training is not a great method for training rate of force development. So conventional heavy lifting does not really improve rate of force development. But basically screen them, look at maximal strength, look at relative rate of force development, a couple of time points, and then that'll help your prescription. But I won't talk too much more on that one, just in case you've got some more questions.
No, that's brilliant. And I think it's really interesting to know the little nuances of testing. Like you said, a little subtle change in the stiffness in the rig, or if you're using even like a plyometric box for like an Alex Natera kind of long hip bridge, maybe that gives you a little bit of give as well. So being real consistent, but also detailed with the setup, I think is really, really important. And then breaking down how do you assess that and what's the most reliable number to get. And there's some really good little tips in there. I've written down a few with regards to the testing protocol for looking at rate of force development as opposed to looking at peak force. And it makes sense from reading your papers as to why you would look at those slightly different and expose those to slightly different based on the neural elements of those. You mentioned making peak force relevant to maximal force, peak RFD relevant to maximal force. Is that right? Is that potentially more applicable to performance and rehab, or does it influence one area a little bit more or less?
So I just probably a combination of both. I mean, on a performance level, so looking at relative rate of force development, so that just means that, rather than saying you're hitting 150 newtons at 100 milliseconds, we're saying, okay, you're hitting 25% of your maximum voluntary force. So you're just normalizing to their peak force. So you can kind of get rid of the role of strength because everything's relative to that person's maximal strength. And that's where you can look at, okay, you're only hitting, so on a diagnostic point of view for rate of force development, at 100 milliseconds, you're only hitting 30%. And what we've shown in one of our studies was there's a massive variability in relative rate of force development. And so at 50 milliseconds, some people can achieve up to 30% of their peak force. Other people can only achieve around 5%, 6%. So there's actually this massive variability. And we actually showed about a 10, 12 times variability. That meant the weakest person was 12 times weaker than the strongest person, or the strongest person was 12 times stronger than the weakest person. But when you look at maximal strength, there's only about a 2 times difference. So that means that the strongest person is only 2 times stronger than the weakest person. So that's where you can start to look at what's your relative RFD. So a relevant time point would be 100 milliseconds. And if you're only hitting 25% of your peak force, theoretically, you could almost double that through the right type of training. So that's how I'd think about it. On a performance level, it's relevant. On a rehab level, also relevant. Relative RFD is probably beginning to be slightly more influenced after an injury. It's a complex answer as to why, but what was shown in some of the ACL rehab is that at 6 months after an ACL reconstruction, most patients have restored their their leg press strength, their leg press maximal voluntary force. But actually, there's still about a 40% deficit in rate of force development. So their peak force is restored, but there's a 40% deficit in RFD. The reason for that is probably because of the type of training, and probably also because of the loading paradigms that are used within the strength process, in that low intensity, moderate to high volume is probably going to favor more the low threshold motor units. It's probably going to favor more the slow twitch fibers, whereas we do need higher intensities to challenge those fast twitch fibers. We know that slow twitch and fast twitch have very similar specific tension. That means at peak force, that both fiber types can produce pretty similar levels of force. The specific tension, specific tension means that the amount of force that can be produced for a given amount of muscle size. So the specific tension is quite similar across fiber types, but actually the rate of force development and power characteristics are hugely different. So fast twitch are really designed for producing force really quickly and for producing force at higher velocities. So chances are that during rehab, lower intensities are targeting more the slow twitch fibers, and they're not restoring those high threshold motor units. So people are going back with deficits in RFD. And then in that follow, as part of that study, it was the Angelozzi 2012 paper. They also showed that at 12 months, following some power-based training and rate of force development training, they then fully restored RFD. So I would say it's relevant for both on a performance and rehab level, but certainly there's a need to incorporate it into the rehab process. Very few people are measuring rate of force development as part of rehab. And unfortunately, very few people are measuring strength as part of rehab. So there is a reasonable distance we need to go with it.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess the last area that we're going to talk about is the role of fatigue, because you published another paper a bit later on in 2014 just on the role of fatigue and its effect on rate of force development. And obviously this is important for both performance. For example, match day +2 monitoring and stuff like that might be influenced, but also from a rehab point of view, if the first 0 to 50 milliseconds of injury, for example. So can you talk a little bit about the roles of fatigue and what contributes primarily to a drop off in RFD?
Yeah, of course. Obviously did that paper back in 2014, and at that stage there wasn't anything on RFD and fatigue. And so what we did was this, basically it was a series of explosive isometric contractions. And we looked at, again, EMG, same kind of setup as all of our stuff, EMG, twitch contractions, octet, maximal contractions, and rate of force development. And what we showed over the series of 50 explosive contractions was quite a large drop-off in both maximal strength and rate of force development, but relative RFD decreased as well. So there was a bigger drop-off in rate of force development than there was maximal strength. The reason for that was a mix between neural and peripheral factors, neural and intrinsic contractile factors. There was quite a large drop-off in voluntary activation, but there was also a drop-off in twitch contractions and the octet. What we basically showed was, because EMG or neural activation is a stronger determinant for RFD, any drop-off in activation is going to impact that a little bit more. So if you do have neural fatigue, so an inability to drive the muscle at sufficient firing frequency, or an inability to recruit those motor units, then that have a bigger impact on RFD because it's a stronger determinant for RFD. Basically the relevance there is that the first 100 milliseconds was more impacted than peak force. And we know that the first 100 milliseconds is more important for joint stability and very rapid explosive contractions like sprint running as well. So this could maybe play a role in injuries, why some people get a little bit more injured, particularly the hamstrings towards the end of match play as well. Obviously, what we did look at with this, where it's different from some of the other fatigue bits, is I would characterize this as kind of acute fatigue. So this is sustained contractions over a short period of time. But if you allow recovery, that's probably going to come back to normal. Whereas the relevance in football is that's more about cumulative fatigue. So that's a reduction in force production over the course of match play. So with football, you have those intense 5-minute periods that's going to cause fatigue. But you also, based on a lot of the hamstring research and the other stuff, is at half time, you're going to have a 10-15% drop off in strength. By the end of match play, you might be at 20%. So that's a slightly different type of fatigue. So I only really looked at acute fatigue. I didn't look at the cumulative fatigue over the course of match play, which I kind of wish I did, to be fair, because then at that stage no one had done it, and it would have probably been a slightly more exciting study. But at least for this, we got to show that fatigue, impacts RFD a little bit more, and we did it in a very nice, controlled lab way. A little bit less relevant to football, but at least it was answered quite scientifically, which was nice.
That's brilliant. And I guess my question would be, if you're observing an acute fatigue effect from your assessments, or you put it down to acute fatigue effect, is there anything that you can do quite quickly, or anything you recommend with regards to like giving them some maximal isometric contraction work, or giving them some ballistic contraction work to improve that? Or do you know what I'm saying? So if you're coming in a bit fatigued, is what kind of things would you do to try and prime them up a little bit? Say you've got a match day +2 and they've pulled up a little bit on your testing, and you feel that their relative RFD is down, and you don't think you can modify them or whatever, they've got an important game coming up, but is there anything you could dose them to try and prime them up a little bit?
So it'd be speculative in terms of probably not really an evidence-based answer, but I think that's the same thing with just general kind of prep, which we do a lot of people. If people come in, they've got muscle soreness, they're feeling a bit tight, not feeling great, probably wouldn't recommend anything above and beyond the typical massage, stretching, good warm-up. Obviously, you probably could throw in some explosive isometrics in there. So a lot of the PAP research stuff would use maximal contractions, of course, to try and get that PAP effect. There's not that much research around using explosive isometric contractions and seeing whether or not that would then have that same kind of post-activation potentiation of performance impact. So there is possibly, if you've got if you have got that match day +2, and they are coming in and they are a bit stiff and they do need that, they just need to be ready to play that game. Probably putting in some explosives as part of the warm up. Obviously, there with the explosive stuff, it's teasing out versus a traditional warm up. So it could just be that you get that same explosive effect just for doing a good warm up. For doing some high speed running and just traditional good quality warm up might be the same impact. So probably on an RFD level, probably nothing above and beyond what people would traditionally do. It's just a good prep, really.
Cool, fantastic. And
sorry, not much great insight there.
No, that's all right. Yeah, that's
keep
all
doing
right.
what you're doing.
Yeah, it's good to know. I guess the last bit again would be, so where do you see the future of RFD research kind of going? If you were to maybe pick up another study or try and publish a bit of research, where do you think the next step for rate of force development in research is going to be? Yeah,
so I think for me, where some of the stuff that's come out is great is, we've got really good understanding now of the determinants of performance, but the situation in which we've done it and the population in which it's been done is probably not the most reflective. What I mean by that is we've mostly looked at isolated single joint tasks, which we're presuming relates to functional performance. And we're all interested in functional performance, the ability to sprint, run, change direction, stabilize joints under realistic tasks. So there's still that big disconnect from what's happening in the lab versus what we really want to understand. So I think the need to transition to multiple joint setups is probably quite important. Secondly, around that is one of my studies looked at sort of the role of coordination and explaining the difference between isometric and isoinertial strength. So, say an isometric squat setup versus a squat 1RM setup. Obviously, isometric measurements reduce the role of skill and coordination. So chances are what they're doing is they're overplaying the role of muscle morphology and underplaying the role of skill and coordination. So I think that we need to move towards more reflective tasks that allow for the role of skill and coordination to be more represented. In that the simpler task you use, the less skill you require. Hence, it's not going to be that important as a determinant. So most of our stuff is looked at agonist activation, whereas we've ignored that role of intermuscular coordination. So the agonists, the antagonists, the stabilizers, the synergists, and how important they are. Chances are, as soon as we move to a dynamic situation, your ability to appropriately stabilize that joint with good stabilizer control, that's probably quite important, because if you don't get that stability, the muscle won't work optimally. So that role of the stabilizer system, I think, needs to have a stronger input. And also on that is the training studies need to be longer term. So, some excellent work from Jonathan Vollin's lab, and Neil Tillin did some fantastic stuff around explosive isometric contractions. So looking at short 4-week studies, explosive isometrics, what they showed was by doing explosive isometrics, you can improve rate of force development by 40 to 50% over a 4-week window. So really rapid improvements. But these are in untrained people. So chances are what happens is 4 to 5 weeks of training, you maximize agonist activation. You actually no longer have a window for training. So that could just be a 4 to 6 week training adaptation. And then long-term stuff is muscle morphology, intrinsic contractile properties, maximal strength. So the fact that agonist activation is really important in the early phase could be because the population we're looking at are just untrained individuals. And as soon as you switch to an elite population, you might find different determinants. So I'd like to see that a little bit more reflective measurements that's more specific, and then the population that's more relevant to what we're looking at as well.
Fantastic. Yeah. Great answers, mate. And I guess that brings us to the end of part 1, where we're looking at RFD, and soon we'll go on to some of your on-field rehab for parts 2 and 3. But just for our listeners, are you on social media, or what's the best way for them to keep up to date? I know that you've got some interesting stuff coming out as always. How is it best for the listeners to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Probably research-wise, probably is Twitter, and I'm not as active as I need to be. So I probably need to start to be more active on Twitter. But so yeah, it can be found on Twitter. So I think my Twitter handle is M_Buckthorpe, and yeah, I'll try and be more active on there. But most of the research stuff I've generally put out on that. So any new research would go on Twitter. And then of course LinkedIn, if anyone wants to contact me, very happy to be contacted. And email wise, happy to share emails. My email is just mbuckthorpe@hotmail.com. So again, if people want to reach out, got any questions, need access to any papers. I know sometimes that can be quite hard with a lot of paywalls. So myself, like many researchers, are really happy for you just to contact us, email us, ask for a paper, and very happy to do that as well.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. Thanks again for coming on, and we'll catch up shortly for part 2, but thanks for your time for this one, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Big thank you again to Matt for coming on the show and discussing in detail some of his PhD work around rate of force development and how it applies to both research and practice. Stay tuned for part 2 and 3 with Matt, where he goes on to discuss some of his practical frameworks on producing high quality on-field rehab. To find more Informed Performance content, head to informedperformance.com, where you can find all our episodes as well as articles and courses from top professionals in performance and sports medicine. And don't forget, you can also find us on social media at Informed Performance on Instagram or at InformedPod on Twitter. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast. Catch us next time for more performance and sports medicine insights.